The September afternoon light filtered through the Venetian blinds of Edouard's modest two-story home in suburban Cleveland. Casting long shadows across the hardwood floors he had installed himself 30 years ago. The 59-year-old contractor lay propped up in his hospital bed, rented and positioned in what used to be his living room, the familiar surroundings now transformed into a makeshift recovery space. 3 weeks had passed since the hip replacement surgery, and the prescription bottle on his nightstand rattled with fewer pills each day. The physical therapy sessions were brutal, but Edouard had endured worse. What he hadn't anticipated was the emotional toll of complete dependence on others, specifically his family. "Dad, can you please keep it down? I'm trying to work," called Jessica, his 31-year-old daughter, from the kitchen where she sat hunched over her laptop. Her voice carried the sharp edge of exhaustion that had become her default tone since moving back home to help with his recovery. Edouard shifted uncomfortably, the mechanical bed creaking under his weight. At 6'2" and still broad-shouldered despite his age, he felt like a giant trapped in a child's toy, his weathered hands, scarred from decades of construction work, fumbled with the TV remote. The afternoon talk show droned on, but he wasn't really watching, just grateful for the company of voices that didn't judge him for needing help. The front door slammed, and Edouard heard his son Marcus trudging up the steps. At 28, Marcus had been living in the basement since his divorce 2 years ago, supposedly saving money but mostly drowning his sorrows in video games and delivery food. The sound of his heavy footsteps on the stairs had become as predictable as clockwork, home from his warehouse job at 3:15 p.m., straight downstairs, without a word. "Marcus, honey, can you help me get your father his afternoon medication?" Jessica called out, her fingers never stopping their dance across the keyboard. "I'm tired, Jess. Just got off a double shift," Marcus replied, his voice muffled through the basement door. Edouard closed his eyes, feeling the familiar burn of shame in his chest. Before the surgery, he had been the pillar of this family. When Jessica's startup failed 3 years ago, he had welcomed her home without question. When Marcus's marriage fell apart, Edouard had cleared out his workshop in the basement to make room for his son. He had never asked for anything in return until now. "It's okay, sweetheart," Edouard called to Jessica, his voice hoarse from the pain medication. "I can wait." Doom. But Jessica was already on her feet, her laptop forgotten as she stormed toward the basement door. "Marcus, Dad needs his pills now, not when it's convenient for you." "Jesus Christ, Jess, I said I'm tired." "And I said Dad needs his medication." Edouard watched his children argue through the doorway, their voices rising with each exchange. Jessica's auburn hair, so much like her mother's, fell across her face as she gestured angrily. Marcus appeared at the top of the basement stairs, his work uniform wrinkled and stained, dark circles under his eyes that reminded Edouard of his own reflection lately. "Look, I didn't ask to be Dad's nursemaid," Marcus said, his voice carrying a bitter edge that made Edouard's heart clench. "I work 10-hour shifts, and I come home to more work." "Nobody asked you to be anything," Jessica snapped back. "We're all doing our part here." "Are we? Because last I checked, you're working from home on your laptop while I'm the one lifting boxes all day." "I'm managing his care schedule, coordinating with the insurance company, handling all his appointments." "Guys, please," Edouard interrupted, his voice barely above a whisper, but they continued as if he hadn't spoken. The argument escalated, voices bouncing off the walls of the small house like ricochets. Edouard closed his eyes and remembered another September afternoon, 23 years ago, when he had been installing kitchen cabinets in this very house, while 6-year-old Jessica colored at the dining room table and 3-year-old Marcus napped upstairs. His wife Sarah had been making dinner, humming softly to herself, and the house had felt like a sanctuary. Sarah had been gone for 8 years now. Cancer had taken her quickly and mercilessly, But in moments like these, Edward missed her presence like a physical ache. She would have known what to say, how to bring peace to this chaos. "You know what?" Marcus was saying, his voice now loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "Maybe Dad should have thought about this before he let us both move back home. Maybe if he hadn't enabled us, we'd actually have our own lives by now." "Enabled us?" Jessica's voice pitched higher. "He was being a good father." "Was he? Or was he just afraid of being alone in this house?" Edward opened his eyes, staring at the ceiling where a water stain from last winter's ice dam still marked the plaster. Marcus's words hit deeper than any physical pain he had endured in the past month. Was that what his children thought, that his generosity had been selfish? "I need water," Edward said quietly, but neither of his children heard him over their continued argument. "Dad's medications?" Jessica said, her voice now sharp as broken glass. "Now, Marcus." "Fine," Marcus replied, stomping toward the kitchen. "But I'm not doing this forever. None of us signed up to be his servants." The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Edward felt something break inside his chest, not his ribs, which had been sore from the surgery, but something deeper, something that had been holding his family together for decades. "We're not your servants!" Jessica suddenly screamed, her composure finally cracking completely. "I have a life too, Dad. I have dreams and goals, and I can't spend the rest of my youth taking care of you." The silence that followed was deafening. Edward could hear the neighbor's dog barking 3 houses down, the distant hum of traffic on Cedar Road, the whisper of the heating system cycling on. But from his children, nothing. Marcus appeared in the doorway holding a glass of water and the pill organizer Edward's physical therapist had recommended. His face was flushed with anger and embarrassment, but he wouldn't meet his father's eyes. "Here," Marcus said, setting both items on the nightstand with more force than necessary. Jessica stood frozen in the doorway, her hand covering her mouth as if she could somehow take back the words she had screamed. Her eyes were wide with horror at her own outburst. "Dad, she began, but Edward held up his hand. "It's okay," he said quietly. "You're both tired. We all are." But it wasn't okay. As his children retreated to their respective corners of the house, Jessica to her laptop, Marcus to his basement cave, Edward stared at the pills in his palm and felt more alone than he had since Sarah's funeral. The house settled into an uncomfortable quiet. Outside, the September sun was beginning to set, painting the living room walls in shades of amber and gold. Edward's phone sat on the nightstand next to his water glass, and after nearly an hour of listening to Jessica type furiously in the kitchen and Marcus play video games downstairs, he picked it up. His fingers, stiff from arthritis and surgery, slowly navigated to his contacts. He scrolled past Jessica's number, past Marcus's, past old work associates and friends from church, until he found the name he was looking for. Robert Chen, attorney. Edward stared at the contact for a long moment, remembering the last time he had called Robert to update his will after Sarah's death. That had been a straightforward visit, updating beneficiaries and ensuring his children would inherit everything he had worked for. Now, he was considering something entirely different. The house was quiet, except for the soft clicking of Jessica's keyboard and the muffled sounds of Marcus's video game. Edward looked around the living room, at the family photos covering every surface, at the handmade bookshelf in the corner, at the recliner where Sarah used to sit and read romance novels on Sunday afternoons. He thought about Marcus's words, "We're not your servants." He thought about Jessica's scream, "I can't spend the rest of my youth taking care of you." With a deep breath that sent pain shooting through his healing hip, Edward pressed the call button. "Chen and Associates, this is Robert." Robert, it's Edward Kowalski. I need to talk to you about my will." The law office of Chen and Associates occupied the second floor of a renovated Victorian house in Cleveland Heights, its tall windows offering a view of the changing leaves that painted the neighborhood in brilliant reds and golds. Robert Chen, a slender man in his early 40s with graying temples and wire-rimmed glasses, had been practicing estate law for nearly 20 years, but the phone call he had received from Edward Kowalski 3 days ago still troubled him. Edward sat across from Robert's mahogany desk, his cane propped against his chair, wearing the same navy blue dress shirt he had worn to Sarah's funeral, the only formal clothing that still fit his post-surgery body. The October morning was crisp, and Edward had insisted on driving himself to the appointment despite his children's protests. "I appreciate you coming in so soon after your surgery," Robert said, reviewing the file spread before him. "When we last updated your will, everything was fairly straightforward. Your assets, the house, your retirement savings, the small investment portfolio, all divided equally between Jessica and Marcus upon your death." Edward nodded, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "That was when I thought they were grateful to have a father." Robert had known Edward for 15 years. Having handled the legal paperwork when Edward's construction company had dissolved, and later when Sarah had died. He had never seen the man look so defeated. "Edward, before we discuss any changes, can you tell me what's prompted this visit? On the phone, you mentioned wanting to completely restructure your estate." Edward was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at a young mother pushing a stroller down the tree-lined street. "Do you have children, Robert?" "2 daughters, 8 and 12. "Then you understand what it means to love someone more than your own life." Edward's voice was steady but hollow. "I thought that love was reciprocated. I was wrong." Robert leaned back in his chair, recognizing the pain of a parent who felt betrayed by his children. He had seen it before. Families torn apart by caregiving stress, by financial pressure, by the simple cruelty that people sometimes inflicted on those who loved them most. "Tell me what happened." Edward recounted the events of that September afternoon, his voice never rising above conversational level, but carrying the weight of deep hurt. He spoke about the arguments, the resentment, his children's obvious desire to be anywhere but caring for their father. "They called themselves my servants," Edward concluded. "Said they never signed up to take care of me. I raised them, Robert. I gave them everything I had, opened my home when they needed it, never asked for anything in return. And when I finally needed them—" "Caregiving is stressful," Robert offered gently. "People say things they don't mean when they're overwhelmed." "Do they?" Edward's blue eyes, faded but still sharp, met Robert's gaze. "Because I've been thinking about it for weeks now, and I realize they weren't wrong. They didn't sign up to be my servants. They didn't choose this responsibility, so I want to relieve them of it." Robert opened a fresh legal pad and picked up his pen. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I want to change my will. Instead of leaving everything to Jessica and Marcus, I want to donate my entire estate to St. Vincent Charity Medical Center. Specifically to their program that helps seniors who don't have family support." The lawyer's pen stopped moving. "Edward, that's a significant decision. Your estate is worth approximately $400,000. The house, your retirement savings, investments. You're talking about completely disinheriting your children." "I'm talking about giving my money to people who might actually appreciate it." Edward's voice remained calm. "People who understand what it means to care for others without calling it servitude." Robert set down his pen and studied his client's face. Edward's jaw was set with the same determination Robert had seen when the man had fought the insurance company over Sarah's medical bills. "Have you discussed this with Jessica and Marcus?" "No, and I don't intend to until after the papers are signed." "Edward, I have to ask, are you doing this out of hurt or because you genuinely believe it's the right thing to do?" Edward was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. Through the window, the young mother had stopped to talk to an elderly man walking his dog. Edward watched as she helped the man untangle the leash from a fire hydrant, their conversation animated and friendly. "Maybe both," he admitted. "But does it matter? They've made it clear they don't want the responsibility of caring for me. This way, they won't have to feel guilty about putting me in a nursing home, and they won't have to pretend they're grateful for an inheritance from someone who was such a burden." Robert had handled enough family disputes to recognize the complexity of this situation. "What about your practical needs? Who will care for you if not Jessica and Marcus?" "I've been looking into assisted living facilities. There's a nice place called Golden Years Manor about 20 minutes from here. They have an opening in their independent living section, and when I need more care, they have skilled nursing on site." "That's expensive, Edward. Even with your savings and Social Security, the costs could—" "That's why I'm selling the house too." Edward's voice was matter-of-fact. "I'll put it on the market next month. The proceeds will cover my care for the rest of my life, and whatever's left goes to the hospital." Robert leaned forward, his professional demeanor softening. "Edward, I've been practicing law for 20 years, and I've seen a lot of families go through difficult times. Caregiving stress is real, and it brings out the worst in people sometimes, but it also passes. Relationships can heal." "Can they?" Edward asked. "When someone shows you who they really are, Robert, shouldn't you believe them?" The lawyer sighed, recognizing the futility of arguing with a man who had made up his mind. "If you're determined to do this, I need to make sure you understand the implications. Once these papers are signed and notarized, Jessica and Marcus will have no legal claim to your estate. They'll inherit nothing." "I understand. And if you change your mind later, we'll need to draft entirely new documents." I won't change my mind." Robert studied Edward's face one more time, looking for any sign of doubt or hesitation. He found none. "All right. I'll draft the new will and the power of attorney documents. I'll also prepare paperwork for the charitable trust to ensure the hospital receives your donation efficiently." They spent the next hour going over details, the specific programs Edward wanted to support, the timeline for executing his plans, the legal language needed to ensure his wishes were crystal clear and uncontestable. As they concluded their meeting, Robert walked Edward to the door. "Can I offer you some advice as someone who's seen a lot of families in crisis?" Edward paused, his hand on the doorknob. "Don't burn bridges you might want to cross later. Sometimes the people we love most are the ones we hurt most easily, and sometimes they hurt us the same way." Edward nodded politely, but didn't respond. As he walked carefully down the stairs, favoring his healing hip, Robert watched from the window. The older man moved slowly but with purpose toward his pickup truck, the same determination in his posture that had carried him through 40 years of construction work and 8 years of widowhood. Robert returned to his desk and began drafting the documents that would effectively disinherit Edward's children. As an attorney, it was his job to execute his client's wishes. As a father, it broke his heart a little. Meanwhile, Edward drove home through the familiar streets of his neighborhood, past the houses where he had installed kitchens and built additions, past the elementary school where Jessica and Marcus had played on the playground, past the church where he and Sarah had been married 32 years ago. The house was quiet when he arrived. Jessica's car wasn't in the driveway. She had mentioned something about a job interview at a marketing firm downtown. Marcus would be at work until evening. Edward was grateful for the solitude as he settled into his hospital bed and contemplated what he had set in motion. His phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Interview went well. Be home around 4. Need anything?" Edward stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "No, I'm fine. Good luck with the job." It was a simple exchange. the kind they had shared hundreds of times over the years. But now it felt different, like a conversation between polite strangers rather than father and daughter. As the afternoon light faded, Edward closed his eyes and remembered building this house with his own hands, room by room, while Sarah planned the layout and the children grew from babies to toddlers to teenagers. Every nail he had hammered, every board he had measured and cut, had been an act of love for his family. Soon it would belong to someone else. And maybe, Edward thought as he drifted into an uneasy nap, that was exactly what his family wanted. November arrived in Cleveland with the sharp bite of early winter, frost covering the windows of Edward's house each morning like intricate lace patterns. It had been 6 weeks since his visit to Robert Chen's office, and the new will sat in a manila envelope in his bedroom dresser, signed, notarized, and legally binding. Edward's physical recovery had progressed remarkably well. His hip no longer screamed in protest with every movement, and he had graduated from the hospital bed in the living room back to his own bedroom upstairs. The physical therapist had cleared him for normal activities, though she cautioned him to avoid heavy lifting for another month. What hadn't healed were the relationships within the house. Jessica had gotten the marketing job, a development that brought both relief and new tension to the household. She worked long hours at the downtown office, leaving early and returning late, her interactions with Edward limited to polite inquiries about his health and brief updates about her day. The easy familiarity they had once shared, watching old movies together, discussing books, her seeking his advice about life decisions, had evaporated like morning frost under a harsh sun. Marcus continued his routine of work, home, basement, with mechanical precision. He'd moved out briefly in October, renting a studio apartment across town, but returned after 3 weeks when his car broke down and he couldn't afford both rent and repairs. His presence in the house felt more like that of an unwelcome boarder than a son. On this particular grey morning, Edward sat in his kitchen nursing his second cup of coffee and reading the real estate section of the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Golden Years Manor had confirmed his spot in their independent living facility, with a move-in date set for January 15th. The house needed to be listed soon if he wanted to close the sale before moving. The front door opened and closed with Jessica's familiar, hurried rhythm, keys jingling, heels clicking on the hardwood, purse dropping onto the hall table with a thud. "Morning, Dad," she called, not pausing in her rush toward the kitchen. "Morning, sweetheart." Jessica appeared in the doorway, already dressed for work in a charcoal grey suit that made her look older than her 31 years. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and dark circles under her eyes suggested another late night working on client presentations. "I won't be home until after 8 tonight," she said, pouring coffee into her travel mug. "The Henderson account presentation is tomorrow, and we're still tweaking the media strategy." "That's fine. I'm having dinner with Frank Novak anyway." Jessica paused, her coffee mug halfway to her lips. Frank Novak had been Edward's business partner in the construction company and remained his closest friend. "Oh, that's nice. How's Frank doing?" "Good. His grandson just made varsity basketball." "That's great." Jessica glanced at her watch. "I really need to run. Traffic's going to be murder." She kissed Edward's cheek quickly, a perfunctory gesture that felt more like checking an item off a to-do list than showing affection. As her heels clicked toward the front door, Edward called after her. "Jessica?" "Yeah?" She appeared in the doorway again, car keys already in hand. "I'm proud of you. The new job, getting back on your feet. Your mother would be proud too." For a moment, Jessica's professional mask slipped, and Edward saw a flash of the little girl who used to sit on his lap while he read her bedtime stories. But the moment passed quickly. "Thanks, Dad. That means a lot." After she left, the house settled into its familiar daytime quiet. Marcus had already left for his early shift at the warehouse, and Edward found himself alone with his thoughts and the newspaper he couldn't quite focus on. His phone rang at 10:30 a.m. The caller ID showed Berkshire Hathaway Home Services. "Mr. Kowalski, this is Linda Patterson from Berkshire Hathaway. We spoke last week about listing your home." Edward had contacted 3 real estate agents, ultimately choosing Linda because she specialized in his neighborhood and had a reputation for honesty over high-pressure sales tactics. "Yes, Linda. Have you had a chance to prepare the market analysis?" "I have, and I'd like to schedule a time to walk through the property with you." "Are you available this afternoon?" They arranged to meet at 2 p.m. Edouard spent the morning moving through his house with new eyes, seeing it not as the home he had built with love and sweat, but as a commodity to be marketed and sold. In the living room, he noticed the scuff marks on the hardwood where Jessica had moved her desk against the wall. In the kitchen, the small chip in the countertop where Marcus had dropped a wrench while helping fix the garbage disposal. In the master bedroom, the window Sarah had insisted on enlarging so she could see the garden while lying in bed during her illness. Every room held memories, but also reminders of how those memories had been tarnished by his children's resentment. Linda Patterson arrived precisely at 2 p.m., a woman in her 50s with silver hair and a warm smile that never quite reached her eyes. The practiced expression of someone who dealt with life transitions professionally. "Mr. Kowalski, thank you for choosing our agency. I've done some preliminary research on comparable sales in your neighborhood, and I think you'll be pleased with the market analysis." They walked through each room methodically, Linda taking notes and photographs, while Edward answered questions about recent updates, the age of appliances, and the condition of major systems. "The house is in excellent condition," Linda observed as they concluded the tour in the basement workshop. "You've clearly taken great care of it over the years." "I built most of it myself," Edward said, running his hand along a workbench he had constructed from reclaimed barnwood. "Added the second bathroom, finished the basement, updated the kitchen twice. That craftsmanship shows. I think we can list it at $285,000, which is competitive for this market." The number felt surreal. 32 years of marriage, of raising children, of birthday parties and Christmas mornings, and quiet Sunday afternoons, reduced to a dollar figure that would appear on a listing sheet. They returned to the kitchen table to review the paperwork. As Linda explained marketing strategies and timeline expectations, Edouard's mind wandered to the evening when he and Sarah had first walked through this house as potential buyers. It had been a disaster then, outdated fixtures, holes in the walls, a kitchen that belonged in the 1950s. But Sarah had seen the potential, had squeezed his hand and whispered, "We could make this beautiful, Eddie." "Mr. Kowalski." Linda's voice brought him back to the present. "I was asking about your timeline. When would you like to list the property?" "As soon as possible. I'm moving to assisted living in January, so I need to close before then." Linda nodded, making another note. "We can have it on the market by next week. I'll arrange for professional photographs and staging consultation." After Linda left, Edouard sat alone in his kitchen as the November afternoon faded to dusk. The house felt different somehow, as if knowing it was about to be sold had loosened its hold on the memories contained within its walls. Marcus arrived home at 5:15, his usual stomping entry followed by the sound of the refrigerator opening and closing. Edward heard him rummaging through leftovers, the microwave beeping, footsteps heading toward the basement. "Marcus!" Edward called. The footsteps paused. "Yeah? Can you come here for a minute?" Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding a plate of reheated pizza and wearing the wary expression he had adopted whenever his father requested conversation. "What's up?" "Sit down for a minute." Marcus remained standing. "I'm pretty tired, Dad. Long day." This won't take long." Reluctantly, Marcus took a seat across from his father, setting his plate on the table, but not eating. "I had a real estate agent here today," Edward began. "I'm putting the house on the market." Marcus stopped chewing mid-bite. "What?" "I'm moving to assisted living in January, Golden Years Manor. I've already put down a deposit." "Dad, what the hell are you talking about? You don't need assisted living. You're doing fine." "I'm tired of being a burden on my family." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. His face went pale, and he set down his pizza. "You're not a burden." "Aren't I? You said so yourself. You never signed up to be my servant." Marcus flinched as if Edward had slapped him. "Dad, I was angry. We were all stressed out, and I said things I didn't mean." "Did you?" "Because I've been thinking about it for weeks, and maybe you were right. Maybe I did enable you and Jessica, and maybe it's time for all of us to have our own lives." "So you're just selling the house, just like that?" "It's too big for one person anyway." Marcus stared at his father, searching for some sign that this was a joke or a test. Finding none, he pushed back from the table. "Does Jessica know?" "Not yet. I'll tell her tonight." "Dad, this is insane. You can't just uproot your entire life because we had a few arguments during your recovery." "Go, can't I?" The question hung between them, and Marcus realized he was seeing a side of his father he had never witnessed before. Not anger, not sadness, but something harder and more final. Resolution. "Where will we go?" Marcus asked quietly. "That's not my concern anymore," Edward replied, his voice gentle but firm. "You're both adults. You'll figure it out." Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is really messed up, Dad. You're punishing us for being human." "I'm not punishing anyone. I'm just accepting reality." Marcus stared at his father for another moment, then picked up his plate and headed for the basement. At the doorway, he turned back. "Mom wouldn't want this." "Your mother isn't here," Edward replied. "If she was, maybe things would be different." That evening, when Jessica returned from work exhausted and triumphant from a successful client presentation, Edward delivered the same news. Her reaction was more controlled than Marcus's, but no less shocked. "Dad, you're making a huge mistake," she said, sitting on the couch where his hospital bed had been positioned just months before. "We can work through this. Families have problems, but they don't just dissolve." "Some do," Edward said. "Sometimes that's the healthiest thing for everyone." As his children retreated to their respective spaces, Jessica to her room to make frantic phone calls to friends, Marcus to his basement to punch walls, Edward sat alone in the living room and felt, for the first time in months, a strange sense of peace. The house would sell, his children would be forced to build their own lives, and he would spend his remaining years among people who were paid to care for him rather than family members who resented the obligation. It wasn't the ending he had envisioned for his life, but it was honest, and after months of pretending that love could overcome resentment, honesty felt like a gift he was finally ready to give himself. Christmas Eve arrived with an unusual warmth for Cleveland, the temperature hovering near 50 degrees and turning the expected snow into a persistent drizzle that drummed against the windows of Edward's house. The "Sold" sign in the front yard bore a red banner across its face, the closing scheduled for January 10th, just 5 days before Edward's move to Golden Years Manor. The house felt hollow despite being filled with 32 years of accumulated possessions. Boxes lined the hallways, labeled in Edward's careful handwriting, "Donate, Storage, Golden Years." Jessica and Marcus had spent the past month in a state of controlled panic, sorting through their belongings and making arrangements for their own housing situations. Jessica had found a one-bedroom apartment in Lakewood, close to her office. Marcus had reluctantly agreed to share a rental house with 2 co-workers from the warehouse. Neither had asked Edward for financial help. though he had quietly opened savings accounts for both of them, a parting gift they wouldn't discover until after he was gone. The family had maintained a veneer of civility throughout the holidays, but the conversations were stilted, careful, as if they were all walking on ice that might crack at any moment. They had exchanged gifts that morning with the mechanical precision of actors following a script they had rehearsed, but didn't believe in. Now, as evening settled over the neighborhood, Edward sat in his recliner, one of the few pieces of furniture that would accompany him to assisted living, and watched his children navigate around each other in the kitchen. Jessica was making dinner, a tradition she had insisted on maintaining despite the circumstances. Marcus was setting the table with their mother's good china, each piece handled with the reverence of religious artifacts. The doorbell rang at 6 p.m., and Edward heard Jessica's surprised voice greeting someone at the front door. Moments later, she appeared in the living room with Frank Novak and his wife Carol, both carrying covered dishes and wearing the cautious expressions of friends entering a war zone. "Frank called and asked if they could join us," Jessica explained, her voice carefully neutral. "I hope that's okay." Edward felt a surge of gratitude for his old friend's intuition. Frank had sensed that this Christmas Eve needed witnesses, people who remembered the family as it used to be, who might serve as bridges over the chasm that had opened between father and children. "Of course it's okay," Edward said, standing slowly to embrace his friend. "You're always welcome here." Frank Novak was 3 years older than Edward, his hair completely white now, and his once powerful frame showing the effects of age and retirement. But his grip was still strong, and his eyes held the warmth that had sustained their friendship through 40 years of shared work, shared losses, and shared joys. "How are you holding up, Eddie?" Frank asked quietly, using the nickname only he was allowed. "I'm fine, Frank, really." Carol, a small woman with kind eyes and an unshakable belief in the power of food to heal any crisis, busied herself arranging her contributions to the meal. Homemade pierogies that had been Sarah's favorites, and a cheesecake that brought back memories of countless shared celebrations. Dinner was a careful dance of small talk and forced cheerfulness. They discussed Frank's grandson's basketball season, Carol's volunteer work at the library, Jessica's success at her new job, Marcus's recent promotion to shift supervisor. Everyone avoided mentioning the obvious, that this was the last Christmas Eve this family would spend together in the house where Jessica and Marcus had grown up. As they cleared the dishes, Frank pulled Edward aside. "Walk with me," he said, gesturing toward the back porch. They stepped outside, into the mild evening air, the backyard stretching before them in the dim light from the kitchen window. Edward had built a deck here 20 years ago, where Sarah had grown tomatoes in containers and where the children had played with water guns on summer afternoons. "You want to tell me what's really going on?" Frank asked, settling into one of the deck chairs that would soon belong to strangers. Edward had confided in Frank about the will, about his decision to donate his estate to charity, but he hadn't shared the depth of his pain or the finality of his resolution. "They don't want me here, Frank. They made that clear." Did they? Or did they just act like scared, overwhelmed kids who said stupid things they regret? Edward was quiet for a moment, listening to the sound of conversation and laughter drifting from the kitchen. Jessica was telling Carol about her client presentation, her voice animated in a way it rarely was around her father anymore. "You didn't hear what they said," Edward finally replied. "The way they looked at me, like I was this burden they couldn't wait to be rid of. Eddie, I've known you since we were both young men, with more ambition than sense. You built this business from nothing, raised 2 good kids, took care of Sarah through her illness without ever complaining. But you've always had one fault. What's that? You expect people to love you the way you love them, and when they don't, you assume they don't love you at all." Edward turned to study his friend's face in the dim light. "What's that supposed to mean?" It means Jessica and Marcus are human. They're selfish sometimes, ungrateful sometimes, cruel sometimes, just like every other person on the planet. But that doesn't mean they don't love you. Love isn't enough, Frank. Isn't it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're throwing away your family because they disappointed you. And disappointment isn't the same as betrayal. Through the kitchen window, they could see Marcus showing Carol something on his phone, probably photos from work or his apartment search. He was smiling, engaging in a way he rarely did with Edward anymore. "They'll be better off without me," Edward said. "Will they? Or will you be better off without the complication of loving people who can hurt you?" The question hit harder than Edward expected. He had told himself for months that his decision was about protecting his children from obligation, about freeing them to live their own lives. But Frank's words forced him to confront a darker truth, that maybe he was the one seeking freedom from the messy, complicated, sometimes painful reality of loving people who couldn't always love him back perfectly. "I don't know," Edward admitted. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, two old friends who had shared enough of life's trials to understand that some questions didn't have easy answers. "You know what Sarah would say if she were here?" Frank asked eventually. Edward's throat tightened at the mention of his wife. "What?" "She'd say that families aren't built on perfection. They're built on forgiveness." Inside the house, Carol was insisting that everyone sit in the living room while she served dessert. Edward and Frank rejoined the group, settling into chairs arranged in a rough circle around the coffee table that Edward had made from reclaimed barn wood 15 years ago. As Carol distributed slices of cheesecake, Jessica cleared her throat. "Dad, there's something Marcus and I want to say." Edward looked up to find both his children watching him with expressions he couldn't quite read. Nervous, determined, maybe a little desperate. "We know we screwed up," Jessica began, her voice steadier than it had been in months. "During your recovery, we were selfish and ungrateful, and we said things that were unforgivable. But we want you to know," Marcus continued, "that we never meant it, any of it. We were scared and stressed, and taking it out on the person we knew would always love us no matter what." Edward set down his fork, the cheesecake suddenly tasteless. "It's too late for apologies." "Is it?" Jessica leaned forward, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Because we've been talking and we want to make this right. We want to take care of you the way you took care of us our whole lives." "You want to take care of me," Edward repeated flatly. "Yes," Marcus said. "We want you to cancel the sale of the house. We want you to cancel Golden Years Manor. We want our family back." Edward felt Frank and Carol watching him, felt the weight of their expectation that he would embrace this olive branch, that he would choose reconciliation over pride. "And what happens the next time I get sick?" Edward asked. "The next time I need help? What happens when taking care of me interferes with your lives again?" "We'll figure it out," Jessica said. "Together. Like a family. Will you? Because 3 months ago, you couldn't even bring me a glass of water without acting like martyrs." The words came out harsher than Edward intended, and he saw both his children flinch. But he couldn't stop himself. Months of hurt and disappointment poured out like water through a broken dam. "You think you can just apologize and everything goes back to the way it was? You think you can erase the things you said, the way you looked at me, the way you made me feel like a burden in my own home?" "Dad," Marcus started, but Edward held up his hand. "I spent 40 years building this family, and you destroyed it in one afternoon. You showed me exactly what I mean to you when the chips are down. And now that you realize you're not going to inherit anything, suddenly you want to play loving children again." The silence that followed was profound. Frank shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Carol's fork clinked against her plate. Jessica and Marcus stared at their father with expressions of shock and growing understanding. You changed your will, Jessica said quietly. It wasn't a question. Edward met her gaze steadily. I did. Everything? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Everything goes to St. Vincent Charity Medical Center to help seniors who don't have ungrateful children to disappoint them. Jessica's face went white. Marcus looked like he had been punched in the stomach. Frank closed his eyes and shook his head slowly. Jesus, Eddie, Frank muttered. Dad, please, Jessica said, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. We know we messed up, but disinheriting us. That's cruel. Is it, or is it honest? You don't want the responsibility of caring for me, so why should you get the reward of inheriting from me? Because we're your children, Marcus exploded, his composure finally cracking completely. Because families don't work that way. You don't just write off your kids because they had a bad day. A bad day. Edward's voice rose for the first time all evening. You spent 3 weeks treating me like an inconvenience. You complained about every small thing I asked for. You literally called yourselves my servants. We were wrong, Jessica shouted back. We were horrible and selfish and wrong. But people make mistakes, Dad. People say things they don't mean when they're overwhelmed. Do they? Because I've had months to think about this, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. You showed me who you really are when I needed you most. Carol stood abruptly, gathering plates with trembling hands. Frank, we should go. No, Frank said firmly. We should all sit down and talk about this like adults. There's nothing to talk about, Edward said. The papers are signed. The house is sold. I'm moving to Golden Years Manor in 2 weeks, and my children are free to live their lives without the burden of an aging father. Stop calling yourself a burden, Jessica screamed, her professional composure completely shattered. You're not a burden. You're our father. We love you. Love? Edward laughed bitterly. Is that what you call it? Because it felt a lot like resentment to me. Fine, Marcus said, standing up and pacing to the window. You want to punish us? Disinherit us? Move to some sterile facility where strangers will pretend to care about you for a paycheck? Go ahead. But don't pretend this is about us. This is about your pride. My pride? Yeah, your pride. You can't stand that we're not perfect, that we disappointed you, so you're burning down everything we built together. What we built together. Edward's voice was dangerously quiet. What exactly did you build, Marcus? Because from where I'm sitting, you've spent the last 2 years hiding in my basement playing video games and feeling sorry for yourself. Dad, stop, Jessica pleaded. But the floodgates were open now, and months of suppressed anger and hurt came pouring out. And you, Jessica, you moved back home because your business failed, used my house as a free hotel while you got back on your feet, then acted like helping me recover from surgery was some enormous sacrifice. That's not fair, Jessica whispered. Isn't it? Because I remember a different story. I remember working 60-hour weeks to pay for your college. I remember staying up all night with you when you had pneumonia. I remember teaching you to drive, helping you with homework, walking you down the aisle at your wedding. Dad, please, I remember doing all of that without ever once calling you a burden, without ever once acting like caring for you was beneath me. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Jessica's quiet sobbing. Marcus stood frozen by the window, his back to the room. Frank and Carol sat like statues, witnesses to the complete implosion of a family. You want to know the truth? Edward continued, his voice now eerily calm. The truth is that I spent 60 years trying to be the kind of father my own father never was. I gave you everything I had, my time, my money, my house, my heart. And when I finally needed something back, you made it clear that I was asking too much. We made a mistake, Marcus said without turning around. One mistake, and you're destroying our family over it. "I'm not destroying anything," Edward replied. "I'm just accepting what you already decided, that we're not really a family. We're just people who happen to share DNA and a history." Jessica looked up from her hands, her face streaked with tears and mascara. "If that's what you really think, then maybe you're right. Maybe we aren't a family anymore." She stood up unsteadily and walked toward the stairs. "I'll be out of the house by this weekend. Marcus, you should probably do the same." "Jessica, wait!" Carol called out, but Jessica was already gone, her footsteps echoing in the stairwell. Marcus finally turned from the window, his face hard with a mixture of pain and anger. "Congratulations, Dad. You win. You get to be right, and you get to be alone. I hope it was worth it." He followed his sister upstairs, leaving Edward alone with Frank and Carol in the living room that had once been filled with laughter and warmth and the easy intimacy of people who loved each other unconditionally. "Eddie," Frank said quietly, "what have you done?" Edward stared at the family photos covering the mantelpiece, Jessica's graduation, Marcus's wedding, countless Christmas mornings and birthday parties, and ordinary moments that had seemed so permanent when they were happening. "I did what I had to do," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Frank and Carol left shortly after, their goodbyes subdued and worried. Edward sat alone in his living room as the sounds of packing drifted down from upstairs. Drawers slamming, boxes being dragged across floors, the muffled sounds of his children's voices as they made arrangements to leave. By midnight, the house was quiet. Edward climbed the stairs slowly, his hip aching from the day's emotional strain. In the hallway, he paused outside Jessica's room, where light still showed under the door. He raised his hand to knock, then let it fall. In his own bedroom, he sat on the edge of the bed he had shared with Sarah for 24 years and tried to feel victorious. He had stood up for himself. He had refused to be taken for granted. He had taught his children a lesson about gratitude and respect. Instead, he felt hollow. The house settled around him with the familiar creaks and sighs of old wood and older memories. In 2 weeks, he would wake up in a strange room surrounded by strangers. His children would build new lives without him, and he would spend his remaining years proving to himself that being right was more important than being loved. As Christmas Eve became Christmas morning, Edward lay awake listening to the silence and wondering if this was what winning was supposed to feel like. 3 days later, Jessica and Marcus moved out within hours of each other, their goodbyes formal and final. The house felt enormous and empty, filled with echoes and shadows and the ghosts of what used to be. Edward spent his last week in the family home, packing the remnants of his life into boxes labeled for charity, storage, or his new assisted living apartment. Each item he wrapped and sorted felt like a small death. Sarah's cookbook collection, the children's school photos, the Christmas ornaments they had collected over 30 years of celebrating together. On the morning of January 10th, the closing went smoothly. Edward signed papers transferring ownership of the house to a young couple with 2 small children who reminded him painfully of himself and Sarah 3 decades ago. The realtor handed him a check for $271,000 after fees and commissions, the liquid remains of his life's work. That afternoon, Frank helped him move his belongings to Golden Years Manor, a cheerful facility with wide hallways, professional staff, and the kind of determined optimism that characterized places designed to help people die comfortably. Edward's new apartment was pleasant enough. A bedroom, sitting area, and kitchenette with a view of the facility's garden. The staff was kind and competent. His neighbors were friendly. It was everything he had told himself he wanted. But as Frank left and Edward sat alone in his new home, surrounded by boxes he didn't have the energy to unpack, he realized that he had gotten exactly what he had asked for. A life free from the complications of family, from the messiness of unconditional love, from the possibility of being hurt by people who mattered to him. It felt like the most expensive mistake he had ever made. That night, as he lay in his narrow bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of institutional life, Edouard thought about Sarah's last words to him. She had been heavily medicated, barely conscious, but she had gripped his hand with surprising strength and whispered, "Take care of our babies, Eddie. They're going to need you." He had promised her he would, and for 8 years after her death, he had kept that promise. He had opened his home to his adult children when they needed refuge, offered financial support without conditions, provided emotional stability during their various crises. But when he had needed them in return, they had failed him. And now, in his pursuit of justice and dignity, he had broken the promise he had made to his dying wife. The thought kept him awake until dawn, and for the first time since that September afternoon when his children had called themselves his servants, Edouard began to wonder if his quest for righteousness had cost him everything that truly mattered. Outside his window, Cleveland woke up to another grey January morning, and somewhere across the city his children were beginning their own new lives. Lives he would no longer be part of, lives he had chosen to abandon in the name of pride and wounded feelings. The price of being right, Edouard was learning, was often the sacrifice of being loved. And as he faced the prospect of spending his remaining years among well-meaning strangers, he began to question whether that was a trade he could live with after all. But the papers were signed, the house was sold, and his children were gone. Some mistakes, Edouard realized, were too big to undo, even when you finally understood that they were mistakes. The story would end here, with a family destroyed by pride, miscommunication, and the tragic inability of people who loved each other to forgive each other's failures. It was a cautionary tale about the fragility of family bonds and the permanent consequences of words spoken in anger. But it was also, in its way, a deeply human story, one that acknowledged the complexity of relationships, the weight of expectations, and the sometimes unbearable difficulty of loving imperfect people in an imperfect world. In his new apartment at Golden Years Manor, surrounded by the remnants of a life that had been both beautiful and broken, Edouard Kowalski closed his eyes and tried to imagine a different ending. One where forgiveness was possible, where families could heal, where love could survive even the cruelest disappointments. But some stories, he was learning, don't get the endings we want. They get the endings we choose. And sometimes, by the time we realize we've chosen wrong, it's too late to choose again.